All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the second channel. We've got two poems today by a poet who goes by the moniker of A, just the letter A. Two poems. We have a content warning. There are references to child abuse, eating disorders, and Christian religious trauma. So be advised. As a note, A wrote, I abandoned these a year or so back because I couldn't tell if they said anything new or interesting. Reading them now, though, I genuinely can't tell if they're very good or very boring. I would say most rough drafts probably fall somewhere in the middle. That's a common way to feel about one's own writing. You kind of get too attached to it and you kind of lose your sense of objectivity. I think it's good that you set them aside for a while and then came back to them later. I think that's a very good practice. I think that lets you see things a little more clearly, arguably. Okay, but before we get into the poems, I am going to say, keep in mind, I am not a professional reviewer. I'm just some guy on the internet who likes reading and writing. The opinions expressed in this video are only opinions. My interpretation of or reaction to the work will not be the same as everyone else's, for better or for worse. I will look for the good and the bad, but no matter what I say, don't be too hard on yourself. Just keep writing. And for those in the comments, please be respectful. Also, I'm so sorry for any mistakes or mispronunciations of names or words. If I come across a word that I don't want to say for whatever reason, I will replace it with the word blank. So, here's our first poem of two. Also, I appreciate that our author A numbered the pages, even if it is just 2 pages. It's like you kind of expect that. If you're submitting work professionally, you definitely want to have your pages numbered. But anyway, on burlap knees, I crawl to your feet. On burlap knees, I crawl to your feet. With a leash in my mouth, I bare my chipped teeth. And bream, I will grovel till you open the door. But when the leash is on, I won't move anymore. From my prison, I wail such a sweet springtime song. Sharp wire whines singing along. Pull me out my cage to set me free, and I'll claw at your fingers till you clip my limp wings. I'm child at the table with pliers in hand, mouth full of blood, gut full of sand. You hold my teeth and tell me to eat. On burlap knees, I crawl to your feet. Okay, so some things jump out immediately, but let's take it piece by piece. So on burlap knees, I crawl to your feet. I will say that's a pretty interesting title. I think that's a decent hook. Hang on, I want to see if burlap has like any secondary meanings that I might be missing. Nope, not really. Just kind of a material, right? Here's the Google definition. Coarse canvas woven from jute, hemp, or a similar fiber used especially for sacking. So I guess when I hear that visual on burlap knees, it gives me a sense of somebody whose knees are very worn, right? Very rough, very experienced, we might say. Someone who is on their knees often. And I guess before we go any further, the sense I got when reading the poem as a whole is we have an abusive relationship taking place here, right? Maybe with a bit of codependency, which makes it difficult to just break off the relationship outright. But we'll keep going and we'll see if that is the case or not. With a leash in my mouth, I bare my chipped teeth. Yeah. So that's kind of interesting, actually, that the leash is in the mouth rather than just collared, That kind of adds a layer of cruelty, I think. Yeah. I guess I don't have much more to say beyond that, but we will note the rhyme. So feet and teeth is kind of a slant rhyme. Not so bad. I guess one thing I did ask myself, though, was whether the poem on the whole even needed to rhyme. It's I don't know, any structural decision is going to merit questioning, right? And so in this poem, the question is, does it need to rhyme? And maybe not, right? Maybe the language and the visuals are strong and compelling enough that maybe the rhyme just kind of isn't really adding anything. I don't know. It's all subjective, right? And it's hard to say for sure. We'll keep going. And bream, I will grovel till you open the door. But when the leash is on, I won't move anymore. Oh, okay. So the leash was in the mouth as if being presented to the subject, right? That makes sense. And it's still like a pretty effective visual because it sounds like, the speaker doesn't necessarily want the leash, and yet they present it to the subject anyway. So, like I said, that kind of illustrates a sort of codependency. Hang on one second. I did want to look up the word bream. Oh, hang on. Is that a real word? I wonder if the author maybe meant preen. Uh, yeah, so preen means to devote effort to make oneself look attractive. Um, yeah, I can't find a definition for bream. Maybe I'm just a fool. Well, I am a fool, but especially in this instance where I apparently can't find a definition for this word. Maybe it's a made-up word on the author's part, which I'm all for that, make up words, but, and like, yeah, given the context, I just take it to mean like preem, right? Or I don't know, it sounds like the speaker is trying to present their best self, right? Anyway, I am all for making up words as long as it contextually makes sense. And here, I guess I'm just a little thrown is all. I think I can understand what the author was going for. I am curious as to where the word came from, though. Anyway, I will grovel till you open the door, but when the leash is on, I won't move anymore. Yeah, I think that's, straightforward. I honestly don't have much to say about that, so we'll keep going. From my prison, I wail such a sweet springtime song. Sharp wire winds singing along. I thought wire winds was a good phrase. Using wire to describe the winds. Wire is a good, modifier there. And we get this sense that the speaker really is imprisoned and, they could have just said sharp winds singing along, but to say wire winds, that just makes it a little more interesting and it has kind of a nice sound to it. So that's pretty good. And there's kind of a nice juxtaposition because before we called it a springtime song, whereas wire winds sounds more painful, right? Pull me out my cage to set me free, and I'll claw at your fingers till you clip my limp wings. Okay, so one thing I wanted to note, and I forgot, but we were talking about rhyme. I neglected to mention the rhythm. The rhythm, I think, just is changing. I don't think there's any set meter in this poem, right? And that's fine. Not every poem has to have one. Even the poems that rhyme, you don't have to have a set meter, obviously. But it is slightly distracting, almost. For me, anyway. It's not going to be for every reader. But the inconsistency, right? It feels a little tugging you one way, then tugging you another, right? And I kind of reiterate my point, maybe just experiment and see how this poem would read without rhyme at all. And then kind of the inconsistent rhythm line to line would be a little more justified, in my opinion, if it were just free verse, right? As for the content of the lines themselves, pull me out my cage to set me free. I'm not sure if you wanted the word of between pull me out of my cage. Sounds like a little more folksy. I don't know if that's the word I'm looking for. Maybe more colloquial. I don't know. Tonally, it just caught me off guard as well. It seemed a little different from the rest of the poem, but that's not a huge deal. You can call that nitpicking. Anyway, I'll claw at your fingers till you clip my limp wings. So that seems like almost a mixed metaphor, where we get the sense initially that the speaker is metaphorically like a dog, and then suddenly they have wings, right? Maybe if there were reference to the wings beforehand. I know that that's a colloquialism. I know that that's a commonly accepted phrase, right? Clip my wings. And I understand that the author is using that phrase metaphorically. But I don't know, it could be interesting if there maybe were a more literal reference to the wings beforehand, right? And the phrase were more than just a colloquialism. Because, I mean, those, in a sense, are the phrases that you want to avoid, right? Because it's a cliche, right? Like, everybody knows and has used this phrase. And so maybe there's something with which you could replace it. Or you could have it take on a new meaning if you provided some different context earlier in the poem for the phrase, right? That's what a lot of songwriters do is they'll take a commonly accepted phrase and then kind of turn it on its head or provide new context for it, and that makes it kind of interesting, kind of engaging. I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I don't know. Maybe you commenters know one. Anyway, as for the last 5 lines, also the rhyme, where did the rhyme kind of get away from itself? I guess free and wings is kind of a slant rhyme, arguably, which I don't mind. Um, so blood, I think, is the outlier here, the one phrase that doesn't have a rhyme, right? So pull me out my cage to set me free, and I'll claw at your fingers till you clip my limp wings. I'm child at the table with pliers in hand, mouth full of blood, gut full of sand. Yeah, so that in theory should just be one line instead of two, but I don't know. Like I said, like these are the decisions that merit questioning, right? These structural decisions. And so maybe there is a good reason that that line is divided into two. And you don't have to do anything, right? It's just another one of those things that initially it reads as an inconsistency, but I don't know. Up to you, author. Um, Anyway, as for the content, I'm a child at the table with pliers in hand, mouth full of blood, gut full of sand. So the phrase gut full of sand, I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. Like, I understand the lines before and the lines after, of course. The speaker is pulling out their own teeth, I assume at the behest of the subject, right? Um, so yeah, what does gut full of sand actually mean in that context? Feels like a rhyme for the sake of it, right? And that's another thing we could avoid if the whole thing were free verse, right? And I'm not saying it has to be free verse. I'm just saying that that's something you could experiment with to see if it reads differently, to see if you can. Honestly, if you write in free verse, you might end up coming up with a better rhyme, right? That sounds counterintuitive, but you might come up with a new visual or a new phrase, and then surprise, it works well in the rhyming poem, and you can find a good rhyme for it. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. But anyway, as for the final 2 lines, you hold my teeth and tell me to eat. On burlap knees, I crawl to your feet. Yeah. So, uh, as far as the note that the author left when with their submission, right, where they said, I'm not sure if they're very good or very boring. And like I said, most pieces fall in the middle, most rough drafts fall in the middle. But I personally wouldn't say this is boring. I think it is pretty interesting. I think there are some strengths here. Um, in a sense, I have read a lot of poems like this. I emphasize like this. I haven't read poems that are this, right? But I've read poems where the poem is an extended metaphor for an abusive relationship and for codependency, right? Which is how I'm interpreting this one. That being said, a lot of times in poetry, it's not about what you say, but it's about how you say it, right? Like there are a million, maybe a billion poems about love in existence, right? Maybe even more than that. And yet we don't stop writing about love, right? So, like I said, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So, yeah, there are poems like this, but there isn't a poem that is this. This is the only poem that is this, right? So, there are some strong visuals here. Like I said, the phrase burlap knees, that's an engaging opening line, an engaging title. It's a good hook. It really makes a pensive reader question, okay, what does that mean, right? It's a question that leads to meaning, and that's exactly, I think, what you want from your poem. You want your reader to sort of engage in that way. At least that's what I think. That's what I want from my readers personally. Anyway, the teeth metaphor is one I feel like I've seen a lot. Um, Or maybe, I don't know, not necessarily in this context, but I feel like just the visual of, like, a bloody mouth or broken teeth, maybe I feel that that's used in a lot of poems in general, not necessarily in the context of abusive relationships, but potentially, right? And maybe I only say that because I actually did break my teeth when I was younger, and, I dream about it all the time. And so maybe that just feels particularly familiar to me, the idea of a bloody mouth and broken or pulled teeth or whatever. So yeah, that might just be me coming from a place of particular relevance. But like I said, there are a lot of strengths here. My major piece of advice, and I'm going to just repeat myself again, try rewriting this poem with free verse and just see what it looks like. I'm not saying it's going to be better. I'm not even saying it's going to be good, but just see what comes to you if you don't try and constrain yourself with the rhyme. Like, don't get me wrong, challenging yourself is great. And ultimately, you can decide that this poem should be one that rhymes. That's totally fine. But just see what comes to you if you try to write it as free verse, even just once. See if there's anything that you might want to incorporate in a rhyming version of the poem. Because in some ways, I think the rhyming is holding this piece back a little bit, like with the gut full of sand. That just feels a little shoehorned, and I could be willfully misinterpreting, like maybe, again, I am a fool, right? Let me reemphasize that. So it's possible that I'm just not seeing what that is really saying. But to me, it just feels like it's there because it has to rhyme with hand, right? And so if we remove the need to rhyme, what might we come up with, right? But otherwise, like I said, there are a lot of strengths here, a lot of good visuals, a lot of good adjectives, right? Burlap is a good adjective, wire is a good modifier for the word wines, etc. And I think this poem would strike a chord with a lot of people, in my opinion. So with that, let's move on to the second piece, Theophany. Hang on, let me look that up. Theophany, according to Google. A visible manifestation to humankind of God or a God. Okay, that makes sense. It's like epiphany, but also theology. I like that. Good title. Um, Generally, it's going to be different reader to reader, but in my experience, if I find a title and I don't know what it means, that's great. That's good, I think, because I'm intrigued. I want to know more. I want to know what the title means, and I want to know what the poet has to say about it, right? This is a crazy comparison, but even Megan Fox, she had a poem in her collection titled Lemniscate, and I had never heard that word before, and I was like, oh, okay, all right, Megan. Like, let's see what this is all about. So for me, that's engaging. I like seeing titles that I don't already know the definition of. So anyway, that's enough of a tangent. Let's read the poem. Theophany. Theophany in the glares of midnight window watchers. Telepathy from ghost remnants of our loving Lord. Christ's blood drips from the lips of my mother, and I am made to lick it off the floor. I hide my heresy in horseshit, limerence lyrics, lobotomized and probed by pronatalist promises, forced to eat my own waste and feed my waste to my brothers. I plant my crops in faraway provinces. Okay, so here, just as a first impression, the rhythm and rhyme feel more necessary in this piece, and I can't 100% say why. Like I said, it is kind of subjective, but for one thing, it just read a lot more like intentionally. I felt like the rhythm and rhyme were stronger in this piece than in the last one, and maybe the rhyme was more unique, right? And so for those reasons, it definitely felt more necessary, more intentional. But like I said, that's just a first impression. Again, let's take it piece by piece. So, Theophany and the glares of midnight window watchers. So, already, like I said, that's pretty strong rhythm, in my opinion. And we get a decently strong visual too. Theophany and the glares of midnight window watchers. I think that's kind of curious, right? It has me wondering, what does that mean? Who are the window watchers? Um, what does the poet mean by glares of midnight, right? Who are these watchmen? How is it that they see God in the window's glares, right? Assuming I'm reading that line correctly. So kind of curious. And since the rhythm is so strong, that's just kind of a bonus, right? Second line, telepathy from ghost remnants of our loving Lord. I like the alliteration on loving Lord. It plays well with the alliteration of window watchers in the previous line. It's really easy for alliteration to come off as like too strong or tacky or amateurish, but when it's kind of condensed even to just 2 words, it can read very well. As for the content of the line, telepathy from ghost remnants of our loving Lord, I assume that's in reference to the Theophany, or that is the Theophany that these window watchers are experiencing. It is kind of hard to make heads and tails of these 2 lines, because again, I'm kind of wondering, well, who are these window watchers, and what exactly does this line mean? Telepathy from ghost remnants of our loving Lord. That line, like, feels mystical and even a little bit godly, right? And yet, I feel like, just based on vibes, right? We'll get into it more as we read more of the poem, but the vibes kind of suggest to me that this poem is like anti-theist, or at least from a non-believer's perspective, right? And yet the second line here feels a little bit theistic, like not in a traditional sense, but it feels like there's a power to it, an otherworldly power that a god might have, right? I'll keep thinking about it. So, third line, Christ's blood drips from the lips of my mother, and I am made to lick it off the floor. So pretty strong lips, pretty strong lines, I think, in my opinion. And I really like the rhymes in these first 4 lines. Like, let's read it all again just for rhythm and rhyme's sake. Theophany in the glares of midnight window watchers, telepathy from ghost remnants of our loving Lord. Christ's blood drips from the lips of my mother, and I am made to lick it off the floor. I don't know, I think that's just pretty strong, in my opinion. That being said, the whole I am made to lick it off the floor, pretty similar visually to the last poem, actually. That being said, it is still a pretty strong visual. Yeah, these 2 lines together, I think, are pretty strong, and I don't know, it seems pretty clear what we're referencing here. That being said, the clarity doesn't take away from the strength, in my opinion. Christ's blood drips from the lips of my mother, and I am made to lick it off the floor. To me, that actually conjures, like, communion. Is that what it's called? When churchgoers, like, partake of the quote-unquote body and blood of Christ, right? It's like the mother takes her communion and then lets it drip out of her mouth and onto the floor, and then the speaker has to take communion, but right off of the floor, right? So like I said, even if that's not what it's referencing, the visual itself is pretty clear that there is abuse going on, right? I think that's clear personally. So, as for our next 4 lines, I hide my heresy in horseshit limerence lyrics. Okay, so the word horseshit really caught me off guard because it feels very tonally inconsistent with the rest of the poem. Yeah, I don't have much more to say beyond that. I think you could replace that word to keep a stronger consistency about the whole piece, in my opinion. Limerence is a good word. I'm wondering if it, like, literally means limerick type poem, or limerence is a state of involuntary obsession with another person. Interesting. I didn't know that. A state of mind resulting from romantic feelings for another person. All right, so that then conjures the question of, who does the speaker have these obsessive romantic feelings for, right? Is it God? I don't think so. Sounds like perhaps the lyrics, the poems that the speaker writes are rebellious, in defiance of God, right? Heresy. I hide my heresy in horseshit limerence lyrics. So that's kind of interesting. Lobotomized and probed by pro-natalist promises. That line almost reads as like a little on the nose compared to the rest of the piece. Yeah, it's like the word pro-natalist especially, it's like it's not hard to understand what we're talking about there. And it's like you don't have to wrap this whole thing in a riddle, but like that's a very specific line when the rest of the poem I feel has been a little bit more generalized. So just something to consider there. There could be a word, like even if you just replace the word pronatalist, and you can use another P word, right, to keep that alliteration. But yeah, the word pronatalist feels just slightly on the nose. I think you could replace it and kind of keep the more broad feel that the poem had beforehand. So anyway, forced to eat my own waste and feed my waste to my brothers, I plant my crops in faraway provinces. So first of all, promises and provinces. Good rhyme. I like that a lot. Otherwise, it's a very like visceral, gross line, this second to last one. Forced to eat my own waste and feed my waste to my brothers. Of course, I'm pretty sure that's the feeling that the poet was going for. So in that sense, it works. And I kind of interpret this last line as a little sense of hope that there is something to escape to these faraway provinces, and perhaps the speaker managed to escape already, and the poem, the previous lines of the poem are sort of looking back in a way. So ultimately, overall, I like this piece more than the last one for its rhythm, for its more unique rhymes, for the language. I think part of it is maybe that it's a little more compact, and so the stronger images stand out all the more. I'm going to read through it one more time. It is a shorter one. So, Theophany in the glares of midnight window watchers, telepathy from ghost remnants of our loving Lord. Christ's blood drips from the lips of my mother, and I am made to lick it off the floor. I hide my heresy in horseshit limerence lyrics, lobotomized and probed by pronatalist promises, forced to eat my own waste and feed my waste to my brothers. I plant my crops in faraway provinces. Yeah, that just has a strong rhythm to it. Taking the title, right, Theophany, I don't know. I'm kind of wondering, like, maybe the speaker does believe in a god, but not the Christian God, right? That's a potential reading of the poem. I don't know. I've talked about this so many times on this channel, but it's hard to find the balance between keeping your poem broad and making it specific enough, right? Because in my opinion, you don't want to spell everything out for the reader, because readers like to feel smart and they like to feel like they're figuring things out. But at the same time, you have to give them enough that they do figure it out, right? And so I guess I'm kind of stuck on who the window watchers are, and on this second line too, a little bit, like what this line even fully means and how it kind of fits into the rest of the poem. But otherwise, I thought the poem was pretty clear, right? So yeah, and it's tough because like these lines read very well, like the rhythm is great, and I like the words theophany and telepathy in subsequent lines. That's neat. Yeah, it just feels like, I don't know, that I need just a little bit more specificity. It's tough. It's really tough. It's like you don't want to confuse your reader, but you also want them to actually engage with the work. And to do that, you might need like either a little bit of mystery, or you might need to, I don't know, phrase something in a way that might seem odd at first, right? But overall, I get the gist of the poem, and I think it's strong. Yeah. I hope any of this has been helpful. There are a lot of there are a lot of strong pieces in both of these poems. This one, the Theophany, I think honestly needs less revision than the first one does, but that's just my 2 cents. My word is not gospel, remember. Ultimately, it's up to you, author, what you want to do with these pieces, how you might want to change them. Like I said, there are a lot of strengths, a lot of great word choices. Like I said, the rhythm and rhyme are particularly strong on this second piece. Um, yeah, like I said, I hope any of this has been helpful. I'm not always so certain. Um, but I want to thank you, for sharing these poems with us. That was very brave of you. And I hope that you continue to write because, let's see, you mentioned that you wrote these a year ago. Yeah, you abandoned these a year or so back. If this is what you were writing a year ago, I hope you've been writing since then because I can only imagine that your poems since then have grown even stronger, right? At least I would think so. So keep writing for sure. If you want to keep revising these pieces, I honestly think that would be worth the effort. I think the strengths here merit more consideration, more revision potentially. It would not be a lost cause if you decided to keep working on these poems. That's what I'm trying to say. So good job with these. Thank you for sharing them. Truly, thanks for your support. And yeah, I hope this was helpful. Even if nothing I said was helpful, maybe hearing them read in somebody else's voice was, I hope, helpful. And yeah, ultimately, just keep writing. And if you want to keep going with these, I think it would be worth it personally. Anyway, I always keep repeating myself when it's time to end these things, so we'll just call it there. Thanks again, And ultimately, keep in mind, this is a rough draft.